another episode of Well-Adjusted Mama. I'm your host, Dr. Laura Brayton, and today's guest is Lily Nichols, speaking on gestational diabetes. Lily Nichols is a registered dietitian nutritionist, certified diabetes educator, certified LEAP therapist for food sensitivities, and certified Pilates instructor, whose approach to nutrition embraces real food, integrative medicine, and mindfulness. She specializes in helping people with digestive issues heal from food sensitivities, supporting pregnant women to have the healthiest pregnancy possible, even if and especially when they have conditions like gestational diabetes, and helping Pilates teachers love their bodies and lose weight in the process by ditching restrictive dietary habits, tuning into their body's inner cues, and indulging in real food. Lily is the author of Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. Visit her website at pilatesnutritionist.com or realfoodforgd.com. Welcome, Lily.
Thanks for having me.
I am so happy to have you on the call today and have you share your knowledge and it sounds like really your passion for educating pregnant women on how to eat properly when they have a gestational diabetes diagnosis. So this is hugely valuable for our listeners that fall into that category. So let's start off with talking about, your background is as a dietitian and a nutritionist first. So let's talk about what is the connection between good nutrition and a healthy pregnancy.
Yeah, I got fascinated with the link between prenatal nutrition and the health of a baby pretty early on from some research that I had read from Dr. Weston Price, who I'm sure you're familiar with, where we know that what a mom eats during her pregnancy will affect the health of her offspring and even the health of subsequent generations after that, which is so cool. So we know that good prenatal nutrition can protect a baby from later in life developing diabetes, heart disease risk factors, kidney disease, becoming overweight or obese in life, or even having memory loss. I mean, we can change brain development just by ensuring that women get enough of certain nutrients.
Right. It's so important. I mean, there is a lot of research. You just mentioned a really interesting point, though. It's not even just impacting that the nutrition of a mom isn't just impacting the baby within her at that point during her pregnancy, but it also is impacting future generations. Can you speak a little bit more on that?
Sure. Yeah. It's actually, there's a number of different names that we can give to that idea, but some people call it the transgenerational cycle of disease, where things are sort of hereditary, passed on. But what we know now is that the nutrients that a mom consumes can affect the expression of the genes in the growing baby. So we can actually, in a way, change our genetics. We can turn certain genes on and off if we have the right nutrients. So sometimes that's called intrauterine programming as well, or developmental origins of disease hypothesis. There's a number of different ways to describe it. But what interests me is what can we do preconception and during the pregnancy to ensure that, and it's not like you take away a certain nutrient and you guarantee this gene is turned on or off. All we can do is make sure the mom is getting every nutrient that we know of to support a healthy pregnancy, ideally from real food, because there's a whole bunch of nutrients we don't even have a name for yet, right? So ensuring a really nutrient-dense real food diet with maybe a couple targeted supplements so we can provide all the nutrients possible, and then we're pretty much guaranteeing that we're doing what we can to turn on, quote-unquote, the good genes, and then not pass on some of these other not-so-desirable effects.
Right, and that is such a good point you just brought up about really this epigenetic effect, and I love how you call it intrauterine programming. I haven't actually heard that term, but it is epigenetics. Bruce Lipton speaks about how our genes only control 10 to 15%, and really the genes are turned on and off and controlled by our lifestyle, which diet is a big part of, and so that is completely in our control of what foods we put in our body, especially during pregnancy, and what genes we're choosing to turn on and off, and how that will impact the baby's health in future generations.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's great. So now let's talk about, tell us, what is gestational diabetes?
Sure. Well, there's a couple different diagnoses for their ways to describe gestational diabetes. So let me give you some of them. One of them is diabetes that develops during pregnancy. Another is high blood sugar during pregnancy or insulin resistance during pregnancy. And then the final one, which I think is the most telling, is carbohydrate intolerance during pregnancy, since that points us in the direction of how to manage it. So essentially up to 18% of pregnant women can get gestational diabetes, which is quite a bit. It's the most common complication of pregnancy by far. And what's interesting about it, though, is that, a lot of people think, okay, gestational diabetes is something that's purely caused by changes in the woman's metabolism in pregnancy. And there's actually some truth to that, but what we're finding now is that there's a lot of what researchers are calling pre-gestational diabetes, which is that women are coming into pregnancy with a lot of risk factors and actually probably undiagnosed prediabetes that predisposes them to developing high blood sugar in later pregnancy. So they're finding that a lot of gestational diabetes can actually be predicted in the first trimester if we test for a hemoglobin A1C, also called A1C. And one study, they used A1C in first trimester and then later tested for gestational diabetes the usual way, which is done with a glucose tolerance test, which I can explain later. But they found moms who had an A1C of 5.9 or greater, it predicted their development of gestational diabetes 98.4% of the time. So a lot of gestational diabetes, there's a lot that can be done to prevent it before a woman even gets pregnant. So yes, there are changes in a woman's metabolism that are completely out of our control, which I can go into, that predispose a woman for developing, high blood sugar. That's just normal physiology of pregnancy. But there are also a lot of things that are going on in a woman's metabolism even before she conceives that could help prevent those sugars from getting high enough that it's diagnostic of gestational diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really an interesting area of study. We know that, just to throw out some more numbers, because I know you wanted to hear a little more on the research side of things, we've had some studies lately looking at, can we prevent gestational diabetes, lifestyle interventions, like what's going to happen. And actually a pretty high percentage of gestational diabetes can be prevented, around 40%, some studies have estimated, just by helping moms pre-conception achieve a normal weight and also helping them not gain excessive weight during pregnancy, both of which come down to good nutrition and exercise. So there was one study in particular that looked at moms who exercised 2 to 3 times per week, preconception all the way through 20 weeks of pregnancy, and their risk of gestational diabetes was up to 76% lower than moms who were inactive. So there's a lot that we can do, and granted, not all of it's in our control. So for moms who have been diagnosed, I don't want them to feel like, oh gosh, I've done something wrong. Why didn't I think about this ahead of time? Because there's a number of things, like I said, going on metabolism-wise in a pregnant woman's body that predispose her to gestational diabetes. I mean, for one, insulin resistance naturally increases during pregnancy, especially in the second and third trimester. There are placental hormones that play a big role in insulin resistance, and some of this is just out of our control. It's designed, evolutionary in our bodies to provide nutrients for the growing baby. I mean, our body kind of wants us to be insulin resistant so that our system isn't using up all the available energy and glucose and nutrients and instead shunting it towards the growing baby. So if we happen to encounter like a famine or we can't get food for a number of weeks, which, across human history happened pretty often, there was still a consistent supply of nutrients for the baby. So this is built in, and it's really intelligently built in. But in our world of, food overabundance, especially carbohydrates, a pregnant woman's body, for the most part, can't handle a huge amount of carbohydrates. I mean, if we go back thousands of years to the foods that were available to us, if we were hunter-gatherers or nomadic tribal people, we weren't cultivating grains. We maybe came across some tubers every now and again, but we weren't having like concentrated sugars. Even the fruits that were available were tiny and fibrous and tart. They weren't these like big, gorgeous, juicy red apples, So we just had much less concentrated carbohydrates coming into our system. So for moms that have, predisposing factors for gestational diabetes, like a family history of diabetes, maybe they had a previous large baby at birth, you're overweight at conception, or maybe you're older when you conceive, which naturally we're more insulin resistant as we're older. Sometimes you just got to do the best thing that you can, with the cards that you're given. And the nice thing is that I believe managing gestational diabetes is way less complicated than people make it out to be, especially when you know more information about the role of real food in pregnancy, and we debunk some of the myths around preconception and prenatal nutrition.
Yeah, I think this, your message is so empowering for women that, despite family history and even despite if you had a previous pregnancy with gestational diabetes, if you do actively change your diet and exercise more, then you can really create a different outcome. Right.
Whether or not you have the diagnosis at all, you know what I mean? So
yeah.
Sometimes gestational diabetes is like it's a blessing in disguise because not every woman is putting her health first during the pregnancy. Some people, it's you kind of like surrender to being pregnant, and you know what, I can finally eat for two. It's like in our society that's so weight obsessed, it's like finally there's a time where it's allowed for me to indulge and gain weight, and sometimes that'll lead us to not the healthiest food choices, you know what I mean? And so sometimes the diagnosis of gestational diabetes will in a way force a woman to put her self-care first. So like, okay, I really got to, eat better food. I really got to move my body in a little more in a way that feels good, and that can lead to lifelong changes in how they approach food and exercise. So I think it can be a good thing. It's all about perspective.
Right, I agree. And you're right, sometimes a wake-up call might be necessary to make those lifestyle changes, which can be challenging if you're used to eating a certain way and used to having a certain level of exercise. Then to make a change to that, especially during pregnancy when maybe you're feeling more fatigued, for example, then it can, it requires more effort, right? And but it's like so important, and there's such a motivation if you have that diagnosis.
Right. Every woman who's pregnant, I mean, I've never met a pregnant woman who's like, I don't care about my baby. That's extremely rare. Usually a mom is going to do everything possible in her power to give her baby the best start. And so usually, although it's kind of scary to get diagnosed, I'll be honest, because a lot of doctors play kind of the scare tactics. I mean, there are big risks associated with gestational diabetes, but I think we have to kind of turn the conversation into how can you be proactive in managing this and not be sort of run by the fear of the complications, because moms who actually keep their blood sugars at relatively normal levels, even when they have gestational diabetes, they have no higher risks than a mom who doesn't have any diagnosed blood sugar issues. So that's huge. Like, there's a lot that's within a woman's control when it comes to this.
Right. Good. That's such a good message to get across. I wanted to kind of cover a couple things that you had mentioned. You mentioned that there is an opportunity during the first trimester to get simple blood tests, to have the A1C levels checked. how many women are actually getting that test done? And then number two, can you give a little more detail about what the glucose tolerance test is?
Sure. One, how many women are getting the test done? That is hard to know because this is something that is, I don't have any statistics on it, nationwide. This is something that more progressive doctors are doing. So I had the opportunity to work with the California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program and also a very well-known perinatologist who specializes in gestational diabetes, and I was her prenatal nutritionist and diabetes educator in her practice. And we screened all of our women with an A1C in the first trimester, regardless of risk factors or anything. And by the California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program standards, if your A1C is 5.7 or greater, which an A1C over 5.7 is diagnostic of prediabetes. So if we found out a woman had prediabetes in her first trimester, we treated her as if she had gestational diabetes. So she monitored her blood sugar, she went to a nutrition class, changed the way she ate, we hopefully encouraged her to get some exercise going on, and so we implemented the intervention really early in the pregnancy. And I can tell you our outcomes were fantastic in our office because these women got early care. And they were also empowered to make these changes. Now, if a woman's A1C was normal, so say it was 5.6 or 5.5 or 5.0 or something, then we tested them with a glucose tolerance test at the usual 24 to 28 weeks. So that test is there's controversy on the best way to do it, and so everybody does it differently, sadly. It has different cutoffs for diagnosis or not. The worldwide, they do a one-time glucose tolerance test with a certain amount of glucose. They do 75 grams, and you test the blood sugar at fasting and then 1 and 2 hours afterwards. That's how most of the world does it. The U.S. seems to have issues with deciding what's the best way to do it. So most of the U.S. is still doing a 2-step glucose tolerance test where they do one test with a lower amount of glucose, usually 50 grams, and it's a 1-hour screening. So you come in, you drink this really nasty drink, that's 50 grams of glucose, and they check your blood sugar 1 hour after. If that comes out high, then they have you go in for another test, which is usually 100 grams of glucose, and then they test your blood sugar for 3 hours after that test. There are pros and cons to doing both of these tests, but in our practice, we always did the one-time 75-gram glucose tolerance test instead. But essentially, if any of those numbers come out high, you're diagnosed with gestational diabetes. Now, like I said, different people do it differently. So sometimes they'll say, oh, you need 2 of these values to come out high, and they have all these issues. When we did our 75-gram glucose tolerance test, you needed 1 of the numbers to come out high. And if any of those numbers were high, you were diagnosed with gestational diabetes. And you would monitor your blood sugar, in the mornings and then after meals, and then, change the way you eat. And we'd figure out a way of eating that hopefully keeps your blood sugar at normal levels. And if we're unable to do it with food and exercise alone, then you might have some medication. So those are the 2 major ways that it's tested. I'm going to add in one other option, too, is that, and this is something that's actually used clinically with anyone who's had, bariatric surgery. So in these people, their intestines have been rearranged, so to speak, and they can't handle huge amounts of sugar at once. It can lead to really horrible digestive side effects. So for those women, you have them just test their blood sugar. You give them a meter, you have them check their blood sugar at home first thing in the morning, called your fasting blood sugar, and then at certain intervals after meals. And that's another way to screen for gestational diabetes that doesn't involve the glucose tolerance test at all. So there's different ways. Let's just put it that way. And there's pros and cons to all of them, which I don't know if we even have time to get into.
Okay, so in other words, for women listening, let's say a woman is in her first trimester. This is something that she can have a conversation with her birth provider about, like, suggesting, hey, can we get my A1C tested? It's a quick, simple blood test, and typically you're getting other blood work done during that first trimester anyway, so they should be able to easily add that on. And then perhaps talking about the different types of glucose testing during the second trimester to determine which option is best for her. Right.
And some women will don't want to do the glucose tolerance test, and if that's the case, a great alternative is just to do home glucose testing. Usually doctors will have you do it for 1 to 2 weeks. Kind of the benefit of that is you get to see your body's response to the normal foods you're eating. So, for example, if a woman naturally eats something, a very low carbohydrate diet, sometimes the response on the glucose tolerance test can be a bit skewed because her body isn't used to seeing 50 grams of carbohydrate all at once and by itself, and there can be a delayed insulin response leading to a false diagnosis. Now, regardless of the diagnosis, you'd check your blood sugar after your usual meals and you'd probably see that you're fine. So it's not really, really common that people have a false diagnosis, but it has happened. So for those people who don't want to take it, or you're eating very low carb and you don't want to go through eating more carbs for a period of time before your glucose tolerance test, then I would just do the home glucose monitoring. And more OBs are getting open to that idea. And some people will also offer the alternative of eating like jelly beans or something, of 50 grams of glucose worth of jelly beans. It's not perfect because you are getting some protein in jelly beans because they have gelatin in them. And it's not perfect because it's not 100% glucose, but it is an alternative that some people are also offered.
Well, what you'd mentioned with the home testing over a couple weeks really makes the most logical sense because it's the realistic, what is the woman putting in her body, how is it converted to glucose or simple sugar, and then how is her body reacting to that? Because, a woman who is, let's say, eating like a paleo-type diet, which is, no carbs, essentially, no grains, no sugar, to give her a big shot of sugar, I could see why potentially it would really throw her body off. It's not used to seeing that. And like you mentioned, the drink they give, there's no fiber in it. There's nothing there to help your body, process this intake of sugar. So it could, it just sounds really nasty.
I know, it sounds really nasty. The reason clinicians love the glucose tolerance test is that it's a measured amount of sugar. It's repeatable. It's duplicated in studies all over the world. So we have all this evidence behind it where we don't really have a whole lot of, quote unquote, evidence-based or research-based evidence on some of these other options. So it's convenient. It's easy to have a woman come in and then do this and sit in the office for a few hours, where some women aren't going to comply with checking their blood sugar at home for 2 weeks. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Or maybe they're going to cheat and they're going to check their husband's blood sugar because they don't want the diagnosis. Like there's things about the glucose tolerance test that make it really convenient, but I'd say if you're really proactive and you really don't want to do the sugar drink, then I would definitely request a meter. Usually your doctor can give it to you. Hopefully they'll give you the strips too, because those can get expensive, but still not. At the grand scheme of a few weeks, it's not that much. And do that instead, because you're getting real world information, which is great. Because you might eat a meal that has 60 grams of carbohydrates, or you might eat meals that are like 15 grams of carbohydrates. I don't know. And that'll be interesting to see how your body responds to those meals, because that's valuable information for anybody.
Right, for sure. I think that makes a lot of sense. So I know you really kind of differentiate yourself with your dietitian practice as managing gestational diabetes in a different manner than the standard of care. Can you talk about what the differences are?
Yes. So first of all, the amount of carbohydrates that's recommended by standard nutritionists is 175 grams per day minimum for pregnant women. And
regardless of diagnosis.
Regardless of diagnosis, yes. This is like, with the dietary guidelines, they're like, eat 300 grams of carbohydrates per day. Sure, okay. The same thing for pregnant women. They set a minimum and a suggested level of carbohydrates. So they suggest that women go no lower than 175 grams of carbs per day. Now, we all know that there's plenty of people who do fantastic on a low-carbohydrate diet that is far less than whatever the dietary guidelines recommend. So first of all, I think there's a lot of individual variation on carbohydrate tolerance. But if you have gestational diabetes, and we know that you have literally carbohydrate intolerance during pregnancy, it doesn't make sense to me to provide a high carbohydrate diet. Now, I'm not saying every woman with gestational diabetes can't handle 175 grams, but from working clinically with this population for a long time, I can tell you the majority actually can't handle that level. I mean, for example, just to go back to how we diagnosed gestational diabetes, if they did take the glucose tolerance test and they had the 50 grams of glucose and they, quote-unquote, failed that test and had a high number, if you're eating 175 grams of carbohydrates per day, that means most of your meals are going to have at least 45 grams of carbohydrates. So why would we expect you to be able to have normal blood sugar after eating 45 grams of carbs if you had high blood sugar on a test with 50 grams of carbs? It just doesn't make sense to me, and it doesn't end up working out in practice. Most women given a pretty high carb diet when they have gestational diabetes are going to be struggling with high blood sugar. And then they're going to end up requiring insulin and medication, which adds to it a whole other level of stress. So those are always bad things. Some women will need it, and that is totally okay. But I think there's a lot more wiggle room with the carbohydrate level in the diet, and we can prevent a lot of women from unnecessarily needing those interventions and needing that additional stress of having to take insulin or medication. So I don't believe there's one set amount of carbs for all women, but I do think it's usually less than 175 grams, and I've detailed why and the evidence behind how that's safe in my book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, because there's all sorts of outcry against going lower carb in pregnancy because of controversy about going into ketosis. So that's something that I address in the book. The second thing that I think is much different than the conventional recommendations is that I don't restrict fat intake, especially saturated fats. Most of the guidelines for prenatal care are based around the government guidelines, which hopefully most of your listeners recognize are pretty misguided. And definitely not based on current evidence. We know that fats are a really important source of nutrients for a growing baby. There's many fat-rich foods that are a source of some difficult-to-obtain nutrients. So I really don't think the low-fat diet is ideal during pregnancy. I mean, for example, egg yolks provide choline for a baby's growing brain, DHA, a variety of fat-soluble vitamins. Liver, which is extremely rich in fat and cholesterol, provides choline, vitamin D, the rest of the fat-soluble vitamins, B vitamins, including folate, iron, so much more. So if you're focusing on restricting fat, you're going to be omitting some of these foods that are providing key nutrients for this baby, which, like we talked about, is changing their health for the rest of their life. Another one, just to nail down why I disagree with low-fat diets in pregnancy, there's many fatty cuts of meat or even like poultry with the skin. Those are rich in a specific amino acid called glycine, which is considered what they call conditionally essential during pregnancy, meaning it must be obtained from the diet. And lack of glycine has been linked to all sorts of problems in infants later in life. So things like cardiovascular defects can be linked to lack of glycine. It's absolutely critical for growing the skin and connective tissue and organs of a developing fetus. So, I just really don't think that going low fat is the best way to do it. If you cut out fat, you're missing, a huge source of these other nutrients, but you're also cutting out a whole bunch of different food groups. You just can't get by with boneless, skinless chicken breasts during pregnancy. You need all parts of the animal. And also, if a mom's going lower in carbohydrates, she has to get her calories from somewhere. So we can only eat so much protein, and it becomes a balance of fat to carbohydrates. So if you're carbohydrate intolerant and you can't handle a whole bunch of them, you're going to have to eat more fat. And usually that's a welcomed thing because fat is delicious and it's satisfying and it's filling and it makes everything taste amazing. So I'd say those are the two main things. It's the battle of the level of carbohydrates versus the level of fats that seems to draw up so much controversy.
So, and I think one point that we should probably make is there are different types of fats out there. So, you're recommending, obviously, the good fats. Can you maybe explain a little bit more about what those are?
Sure. I mean, everybody has different definitions of what's healthy fat and not healthy fat. For me, that means fat that's coming primarily from real foods. So in its whole food form, not super refined. For me, that includes both animal fats. I know I gave all these examples of animal fats just because they're such powerhouses of nutrients that are unavailable to us in other places. So certainly animal fats are fantastic, especially when the animals are raised properly, which means the cows are fed what they're supposed to be fed, which is grass. They're grazing animals, right? So they have much healthier bodies and healthier meat and healthier fats and healthier milk if they graze on grass rather than are fed, corn and soy. Same goes for chickens. Chickens that are raised on pasture have much healthier fats, much more nutrient-dense eggs and meat when they are raised on pasture and not just locked in a teeny little cage and force-fed genetically modified grains. I mean, those are not ideal conditions. When it comes to plant fats, which are also healthy, I'm a big fan of, coconut oil, olive oil, which is great for salads. Getting fats naturally in foods like chia seeds are great. Nuts. Really, when it comes down to, is it coming from your food or not? My issues with bad fats, I guess, would be the worst of the worst are the trans fats. So those are the liquid vegetable oils that have been processed through something called partial hydrogenation to make partially hydrogenated oils, which goes into shortening and margarine and frying oils. Those are a huge problem, and those actually interrupt the natural places in our body where we should be using saturated fats. Trans fats will take their place and lead to all sorts of dysfunction in the system. They've been linked to allergies and eczema in infants, eye problems, because the trans fats will take the place of some of the healthy fats in the developing eyes. So those are the biggest problems. And then secondary to that would be just processed vegetable oils. So like corn, soy, canola oil, cottonseed oil, those tend to be highly processed. They tend to be kind of inflammatory because they're easily go rancid, especially if they're stored in a clear plastic bottle or heated to a high temperature. Those tend to be in a lot of processed foods anyways. So if you have the choice of your cooking oils, I probably wouldn't do a vegetable oil. I would probably go for a coconut oil or lard or tallow, which are naturally saturated fats, and they can withstand heating and are much healthier in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about, what's good, what's not good, and, even as far as cooking goes, what oils have, that high heat tolerance, like you just mentioned, that aren't going to go rancid and actually become a trans. Because even olive oil we know is very healthy, but if you heat it in cooking, it actually can become a trans fatty acid and therefore become toxic. So having that awareness about, what oils you need to be eaten cold and which ones can tolerate high heat is important.
Yeah, we've been fed a lot of misinformation about fats, and it's kind of silly because it really just comes down to basic chemistry. Anyone who's taken organic chemistry should be able to kind of see through it, but unsaturated fats are very susceptible to damage from heat or light or air, and so they're really not our best choice for cooking. But yet all of our nutrition gurus, not all of them, the tides are changing finally, but many people will still say, oh, yeah, eat more unsaturated fats. Like, it's fine if it's coming from, like, avocados and you're putting olive oil on your salad, if you're having some chia seeds mixed into something, like, that's all good. But if you're thinking you're making a wise choice by cooking with soybean oil because it's unsaturated, you are very misguided.
Right. I'm sure you probably talk about that in your book as well.
Yes, I do cover all the suggested sources of fat and then the best ones to avoid. So I have a whole section on all the issues with trans fats, for example.
And what about in your book you talk about, we're talking about like a low-carb diet, for example, for
right.
women, especially with that pre-diabetes or who actually are of gestational diabetes. There are some really good carbs out there that are low glycemic index. Do you also discuss that and kind of separate which carbs are the healthy ones that you can eat, in larger quantities, for example, like vegetables, and then ones that should be avoided or minimized?
Yes, absolutely. So, I don't recommend a no carbohydrate meal plan, although that's really impossible unless you only eat meat and pure fat. So, if you're eating vegetables and nuts and seeds and maybe a little fruit, like, you're definitely getting some carbohydrates. And, I do go through the different types of carbohydrates that are best. I really think that getting most of your carbohydrates from non-starchy vegetables is ideal, which is actually the majority of vegetables really are non-starchy. There's only a couple that fit into the starchy category, things like potatoes or sweet potatoes. And even those are fine as long as you're conscious of the amount that you're getting. So a lot of, with gestational diabetes, it's a matter of learning how food affects your blood sugar. And for most women, they're going to find a range of carbohydrates that they can handle at a meal, and which can actually vary certain times of the day, which is interesting. So some women can handle less carbohydrates at breakfast, for example, than lunch and dinner. So that's something that you learn through testing your blood sugar. But as long as you keep that, you find a level of carbohydrates that works for you, and then you keep that consistent. So say your body can handle like 25 grams of carbohydrates at a meal. Great. That leaves you room for maybe some sweet potatoes, and then alongside some other vegetables and maybe some nuts, and that'll be your carbohydrates for the meal. Maybe you include dairy products, which I think if you can digest them fine, like those are healthy during pregnancy. Some of those dairy products will have carbohydrates as well. So like yogurt or just milk itself will have carbohydrates in it. Maybe you do better with like a Greek yogurt, which is much lower in carbohydrates, much higher in protein, and hopefully you're eating the whole fat version, so you're getting some fat as well. Those will tend to lead to less of a spike in blood sugar and just better overall, stabler blood sugar compared to doing like a regular yogurt, or especially like a regular sweetened yogurt, which can be pretty loaded with sugar. The glycemic index, meaning how quickly one of these carbs will raise your blood sugar, is something that I cover, and a lot of that will depend on not only the actual food, but what you match that food with. So, like, if you have carbohydrates by themselves, and I like to call these naked carbohydrates, like they don't have anything going along with it. You have, like, an apple. I'll call that a naked carbohydrate. That will generally digest pretty quickly, leading to a spike in your blood sugar and then a quick drop. Now, apples aren't as high carb as, a big plate of pasta, but just for an example, I'll go with the apple. Now, if you match that apple with something that has a little protein and a little fat, maybe a little fiber in it, such as almonds, you won't get as big of a spike in your blood sugar. It'll kind of even it out. can also keep you fuller for longer. So a lot of this comes down to, how you combine the foods on your plate, whether it's snacks or meals, and a lot of that can impact how your blood sugar is later on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's so helpful for women to know and have like that guidance. And it sounds like there might even be some meal plans, of how to.
Yes. Yeah, I include 5 days worth of meal plans, and I have 3 different levels of carbohydrates. So there's 3 different meal plans for 5 days. So you have 15 days really of meal plans. So you can kind of test out. I give guidance on how you're going to choose which level of carbohydrates at first, and then how you can adjust those meal plans up or down in different foods to give you better blood sugar control. So it's so individualized, which is why I just, again, I can't stand the 175-gram minimum, but I give guidance on how you can choose which level to start at and how you can adjust based on what results you're getting.
Okay. And so there's, I hear this really important message from you that, every woman's body is different. So it's
right.
really having individually understanding that, one guideline does not work for every woman during pregnancy. And
right.
really adjusting and finding what works for your body.
Exactly. Which is why I kind of set up the book in a way that it guides you through what to do first and sort of leads you towards the food stuff. So first you have to get comfortable with what this diagnosis is, what does it mean, what can you do, and then it's how do you sort of get your baseline, which is what's your blood sugar like now with what you're eating. Like, don't change anything. Just check your blood sugar in the mornings and after meals and see where you're at. And then you can start making an assessment on where you need to go. Some women, like I said, some women can handle more carbs than more than 175 grams. I mean, I've had ladies who do just fine on like a 200-gram carbohydrate diet per day, even though they, quote-unquote, have gestational diabetes. That's fantastic. Go for it if that's what feels good for your body. If your weight gain is within normal, great. And I've had other women that need to go, below 100 grams of carbohydrates per day to get there. So I sort of lead you towards the nutrition stuff, learning which foods affect your blood sugar. Those are the ones that I have people be most cautious about. I talk about mindful eating because aside from knowing the carbohydrate thing, we kind of just got to figure out how to enjoy our food and eat to satiety rather than following some super rigid, strict meal plan. So aside from the carbohydrates, I don't even give really super detailed portion guidelines because I think your body should actually guide you in that regard. And there's some pretty good evidence behind mindful eating being much more successful than super strict, rigid diets. So that's something I go through. I also go through the nutrient-dense foods during pregnancy, which I touched on a couple of those earlier. I go through exercise. So like you said when you introduced me, I have a background in teaching Pilates, so I know quite a bit about prenatal exercise, so what's safe and what's not and how to start if you're not already exercising. I do talk about medications, so if you do require them, what to expect, how it affects your blood sugar, what kind of side effects you might get, and how to manage those. There's a whole chapter on just managing common complaints, like why is my fasting blood sugar going high, and how can I change that? That's a huge topic in the GD community. There's a section on postpartum, so there's a lot you can, we didn't even get through this, I think, but women who have gestational diabetes, a lifetime higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes later on. So there's a lot that you can do to prevent that. So I go through that, and then finally there's a chapter on the controversy of carbohydrate levels and ketosis in pregnancy, and some recipes to go along with the meal plan. So I kind of cover the whole gamut, but I try to walk you through it one step at a time so it isn't so overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And I also want to point out something else, that you do have clients all over the country, so to speak, that you work with individually through Skype or over the phone. So if there is a woman out there who has this diagnosis and is looking for support on exactly what's best for her, she is able to contact you and get that one-on-one attention.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and you can find that at pilatesnutritionist.com, which is my main website.
So can you share a success story from your practice regarding gestational diabetes?
Sure. Yeah, there's quite a few. So I'll pick one. I'll pick a story that I just love. There's actually stories all throughout the book, which are fantastic as well. But my favorite are clients who have had gestational diabetes in a previous pregnancy, and what we can do the second time around. So I had this one gal that I worked with who had gestational diabetes in her first pregnancy. She had a terrible time of it. Nothing was explained to her. She was given, her meter, told how to check her blood sugar, and then given a printout of a meal plan. And unless she followed that meal plan exactly, she had high blood sugar, and she didn't understand why, because she was never really taught the basics of how food affects your blood sugar. It was just follow this meal plan. So she literally ate the same foods. Every 3 days she would repeat the foods because she only had 3 days worth of food options on this meal plan, which was awful. So when she came to me and realized, oh, hey, you can actually have way more variety in your world than what you were given before, it was like the whole world opened up and she could actually enjoy her food again. She didn't require insulin the second pregnancy, where she did require it the first time around. She had no issues with weight gain, so she was able to gain, I think she gained about 20 pounds. The amount of weight a woman should gain depends on how much she weighs before she gets pregnant. So she gained right where she should for her pre-pregnancy weight. Her baby was born normally, no complications, not big, didn't require a C-section, no issues. And I ended up following up with her about 6 weeks after she gave birth. She had usually doctors will do a glucose tolerance test to see, do you have diabetes or do you not, postpartum. And her results were totally normal. She had dropped below her preconception weight postpartum. And she even said that her husband had started implementing the kind of diet stuff that she did during her pregnancy. And he had actually lost weight, and he had gotten off his blood pressure medication. I never even met the guy. That's one of my favorite stories, though, is I just think it perfectly illustrates how much this can be a blessing in disguise. It's like, oh, God, I've gotten gestational diabetes again. Oh, this was torture last time. Oh, I'm going to have to eat the same foods every single day. Oh, I'm going to be on insulin. Oh, the whole world starts falling apart. And when you can see a different approach and actually get results from eating actually really yummy food, I love it. It's fantastic. So.
Cool. Thank you so much for sharing that story. It's really inspirational, and and look how it has impacted the family dynamic. So because that woman ate differently,
right.
Certainly her fetus was impacted by that, and then her husband
right.
was impacted, and then now as a family, they're all probably eating more consciously, more healthy, more whole food driven, and the children, growing up will benefit from that diet.
Exactly, which is huge because kids born to moms with gestational diabetes have a 7-fold higher risk of developing diabetes in their life. It's pretty crazy. Now, we know that goes down if a mom has been eating well, but a lot of that is the environment they're exposed to growing up, too. So, if a woman went through her pregnancy, she had gestational diabetes, she, followed the rules, so to speak, during her pregnancy and then goes back to status quo postpartum, her kid's going to be growing up not eating that well either, and so much of their habits are formed early in life. So yeah, that was really hugely validating to have that kind of a story. It was wow, okay, this is making a difference. This is worth it.
Yeah, that's great. Do you have any last thoughts you want to share with our listeners?
Oh, gosh. Well, for anyone who does have gestational diabetes or is just really interested in prenatal nutrition in general, I suggest you go to realfoodforgd.com. I do have a free ebook on there, how to learn the 5 steps to managing your blood sugar naturally. So that includes a blood sugar log, so you can write down, what food you're eating, what exercise you're doing, where your blood sugars are at, so you can start to get a handle on it, and then get going on managing your gestational diabetes. There's also a link if you do want to purchase the book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. You can do it through that site as well. And I just want to say, this is something that there's a lot with gestational diabetes that's out of our control, but there's a lot that is within our control. And it's something that can, food makes a huge difference. Even if you do end up requiring some medical intervention like insulin, food still matters. So, you still want to be eating really good nutrient-dense food to grow your baby, and that will help minimize your need for some of these other interventions. So it's not the end of the world if you get the diagnosis, because it can feel like a very dark hole when women first get the diagnosis. And I just want to, share that there is an alternative. There is another way.
There's hope.
Right.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you once again for coming on and sharing this really valuable information of eating properly during pregnancy and, helping to either prevent diabetes or properly managing gestational diabetes.
Sure, you bet. Thanks for having me so much.